Welcome. It's our penultimate panel discussion of the Paris Couture shows, but it's a suitably sort of lively one to be drawing the couture season to a close with, because we're going to be talking about Jean Paul Gaultier, which is going to be lots of fun, I'm sure. And aptly, I've got a nice, fun panel with me to help unpick his life in fashion and what we're going to see for him this season. But I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, starting with you, Paula.
My name is Paula Goldstein and I'm digital director for Purple magazine.
I'm Oriole Cullen and I'm fashion curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum.
I'm Hilary Alexander and I'm a freelance fashion writer and consultant.
And I'm Treacy and I'm a hat designer.
I want to start with quite a personal question for all of you, because I think, as we were kind of discussing before we went live, Jean Paul Gaultier is one of those designers where you have these kind of favourite memories, and there are these really sort of key moments for him that we all love to talk about, whether it is Madonna or who else. So I'd like to ask whether anyone has any special memories or moments where they first kind of became aware of his work, or anything that they particularly loved. Philip, do you remember when you first, is there a striking JPG moment for you?
He was probably the most kind of famous French designer when I was a student at college, and he's probably the most talented French designer there is today. And he can, you can always tell a Jean Paul Gaultier outfit because he has a signature on it.
And he's funny.
Yeah, there's humour as well.
I remember when, I think it was his 25th or 30th anniversary, he hired a theatre, an old theatre in Paris, and he had all these people doing magic tricks, and Susie Menkes and I did a kind of, I had to be this thing in a box, and Susie was dressed up as the Dowager Empress, and she turned this handle and my head stuck out and I had to go, and it looked as if my body was twisting, and then she turned the handle back and, I mean, it was just bizarre, but he had...
I think we need a reenactment of that.
Virginie, who writes for Le Figaro,
yeah.
She did the sort of lying levitation trick. And nobody could work out how it was done. She lay there, seemingly suspended in midair. It was really, people paid money to see it. I think there were about 3,500 people watching.
Do you think it is that humour that makes him, so is that why we love him? Is it that
I think partly, and plus the fact, as Philip says, he is a brilliant designer.
Yeah, when you say it's quite a bold thing to say, he's the most talented French designer. Why do you say that?
It's, his talent's never ending. There's never a sort of dodgy season or collection. It's always endless. His talent is kind of superlative to other people, really.
And the tailoring, tailoring.
Yeah,
I think he's an ultimate designer. I mean, is he one of the only French designers there are?
Yeah. Well, apart from Christian, and we don't see enough of him, Christian Lacroix.
Yeah.
But if you go backstage, as I used to do, I mean, always at Jean Paul shows, he's there, always, looking at what's been done with the hair, with the makeup, looking at things, and he'll pick something up and he'll, look at this, and people are and he's just constantly completely involved in the process.
And it's always been like that since the beginning.
What's your thoughts on him, Oriole? Do you agree that there's something
Yeah,
special?
I mean, I think that he really understands, apart from his sort of codes, what he looks to popular culture, which is always, with a sense of humour. I think he's very inspired by popular culture. But also, behind that, there is a real knowledge of how, beautiful clothes are made. And I think with his couture collections, I mean, they are breathtaking when you see the garments up close. They're just so impeccably made. So he's a wonderful mixture of sort of that lightness, that sort of effortless creation in a way. So.
It's interesting you mentioned there his reference to pop culture, because I think for young readers, people that read Purple, do you find that that's what excites them about him?
Well, I was going to say, even for me personally, I think he was one of the first designers that I actually was like, wow, this is amazing, this is fashion, this is, because you have a point of reference as a teenager. You can see his clothing and you can find it exciting, and you can kind of see the showmanship and the skill, and there's a way for, I wouldn't say normal people is not the right word, but people who don't necessarily have a great knowledge of fashion can still see his show and be captivated by it.
So there's a natural accessibility to what he does. That's interesting.
And if you think too, I mean, he was one of the first male designers to wear a kilt. And the blue and white T-shirt is, you know, you think instantly Jean Paul.
Yeah.
And then Eurotrash. I think that's probably that series, which is so long ago.
And it was funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Funny.
And fashion doesn't laugh at itself very often, does it? It's not prepared to sort of
But
be...
he laughs at himself as well,
Yeah.
you know, laughs at fashion.
Do we need that a bit more?
Yeah.
Well, he's kind of caricature French designer, and you know, when he designed for Madonna, it was, you know, when he did her Blonde Ambition tour, it was exceptional, and so, you know, a few years later when Dolce & Gabbana did it, it was quite poor in comparison. It just didn't have any impact. It was a little odd looking.
But he'd done it first, you know, that
the cone.
the rocket cone bra.
I'd like to pick up on this idea of him being a French designer, because I think that's so interesting, this idea of a French sensibility and why that's so important. Is there something, sounds simplistic, but is there just something special about being a French designer?
There is. Well, there was.
Well,
it's kind of not like that anymore. It's kind of international. But it was. Fashion was about Paris at one time, and about Frenchness. And he's the ultimate French designer. And he's probably, and he's one of the only French designers who are still working.
I mean, if you think sort of, say 30, 40 years ago, we would have had Christian Dior, Saint Laurent, Hubert de Givenchy, Ungaro, you know, the list goes on and on and on. But today...
There's just him.
And maybe some of the younger ones.
I mean, there are younger ones, but he's the most prolific. And the most French of French designers. Because he carries his Frenchness everywhere.
Yeah, I love that. It's French design.
All that's missing is the string of onions.
Oriole, what's your take on that?
Well, I was just going to say, with the sort of, when he speaks about growing up, it's sort of the culture that he grew up in, you know, that fashion was really a part of that, that he was able, as a schoolboy, to get a part-time job working at Pierre Cardin, you know, and that was something sort of growing up in Paris at the time. Nowhere else in the world could you really do that. So I think he's sort of imbued with that, and really that sort of old school kind of French, you know, Paris as a fashion centre. And I think he plays that to the max. And you know,
is that something to move away and to talk a little bit about couture in general? Is that something that's so important about it? Is having that sort of, I guess, affirmation of Paris as a centre of fashion because of the heritage and history that we have there, but also because of the sort of the craft and the ateliers that we have there. Is it so important that actually, while it's brilliant that fashion becomes more global, we always have this kind of Parisian moment?
Well, I think it is. It's very much, you know, a craft industry, and that's where its base is. And you know, a lot of it's word of mouth. People move between the couture ateliers. It's not a huge thing, and you know, there are these standards, and that's why sort of it's interesting that it's geographically contained. I mean, some people would argue why does it have to be Paris, but it does make sense and it does work.
I mean, the fact is, you know, it is Paris because it was Paris, because that's where it started in sort of 1878 or something with Charles Worth. But it's because of this craft tradition and the fact that Jean Paul is probably the only French designer who does have that experience of working in an atelier with someone like Cardin, for example. But if you look at the young designers who are in positions, shall we say, with some of the big houses, did any of them ever work with Balenciaga, for example, or Patou, or they didn't. Ungaro did, he worked with Balenciaga. And Valentino probably is another example of someone who went through the atelier system.
The couture is really about the kind of studios and the workshops of the houses. And in Paris they maintain that, and they have a history of it, and it's still a very, very serious job. They're like the architects of the houses. So when I've worked for some of the companies, you know, the tailors were, you know, the most respected people in Paris. So that's still very important there, and other cities have kind of lost that in a way. They wish they had it, but it's just that knowledge is still respected and appreciated.
And it must be, I guess, when you, as you mentioned, you know, when you're working in that kind of context, there must be something quite sort of inspiration about those hierarchies and this idea of sort of where you fit into that, and learning from people who've done that craft for so many years. And
it's about knowledge. And you know, if you look in, you know, fashion department stores anywhere in the world, there's you know, they look a little bit like they've all been made. Some of the companies, they look like they've been made in the same factories in Italy, and they have a look, you know, especially in menswear. They sort of, you know, it doesn't matter who the menswear designer is, you look at the suit, it still looks like it's an Italian-made suit in an Italian factory, whereas in the couture houses there are very talented people who are experts at the actual technicality of the actual work, and that's what the couture really is all about.
I think there's a confidence in the craft as well, so you can really push your idea because you have a confidence in the way it's made, that you know that your mind can wander to a real extreme because it can actually be executed in the way you want it to be. Whereas I think some of the other designers who don't have the experience or also don't have the culture, you know, you take yourself back a bit, or you're trying to look at ways it can be replicated or mass produced, or you don't have to worry about couture as kind of pure art in a way.
It's effortless work. It's, you know, there's a lightness to it. Couture is not kind of labor. It's supposed to look effortless, and these crafts people, they make it look like that. So you know, an over-labored garment is not couture.
It's not couture. It's interesting when you say that, because I guess I really want to get an idea of kind of public ideas of couture, because you must find this particularly working and exhibiting. What do you think the public perceive couture as? Do they think of it in the same way that?
I think it's hard too, because it's bandied about a lot, and people aren't really necessarily aware outside of the fashion industry that there is this distinction between ready-to-wear and couture. But certainly within the fashion industry, I mean, what's very interesting about Gaultier, we sort of should credit him, is the fact that he actually brought contemporary fashion, he sort of injected that back into the couture industry, because you know, for years and years people have been saying couture has been dying, etc. But you know, Gaultier was seen as a very contemporary designer, and when he started doing couture in 1997, you know, that was quite a shock. People thought, what's he doing? And it was really interesting to see how he sort of translated his designs into sort of couture, and used, as you were saying, you know, was able to use these people because he'd had that experience of being in a couture house. He knew how to push it and how to translate it, and he was up for that challenge. And I think he brought a renewed energy to the couture industry.
It's interesting, this idea of couture being something that has a kind of a fashion currency. You know, it makes a point about the state of fashion, the state about how people want to dress, because I think there's two separate things that go on with couture. On one hand, it is just about this craft and about this, you know, celebrating the ateliers, but on the other hand there is this idea, and I think that's become especially prominent this week with people like Raf and people like Hussein, you know, doing DNA, and also what's going on at Schiaparelli, this idea of couture being something that the fashion community should look at as something that will inspire them, and even kind of in a very simplistic way will inspire trends that will then filter down, which is, I guess, old school way of what couture should be, that trickle down effect. Is it good though that couture has a fashion currency? Should it kind of be?
Yeah, I think absolutely. You know, it gives it a relevance, and in this day and age, I mean, it's very difficult. Everybody's looking for something different, and it's a wonderful thing that these ateliers are still there. You know, that it's such a different atmosphere, as you know, to the ready-to-wear shows when you go.
The pace is totally different.
Completely, you know, and it is sort of the ultimate. You know, it is, and it's wonderful that it still exists. So I think it's great that it's relevant,
and also it's keeping the ateliers alive and keeping, you know, so many talented people in business. Not to mention the fact that it's the only place, you know, where you can have sort of 3 or 4 fittings for a dress or a suit that is perfectly, in every respect, cut and fitted exactly to fit you.
And for me, I think it also holds on to, there's a certain magic of fashion that's kept with the atelier. You know, that it's not, commerce isn't such a big part of this, you know, it's about the craft. And I think that's very important for the fashion industry, is that we have something that holds on to the pure craft and the art of what we're doing, as opposed to thinking about it as a commercial machine or how it fits into the media or how it will fit into the store, you know.
I'm interested if that's going to make sort of younger people coming into fashion, whether they're reading about it or studying it, excited about couture again, purely because, you know, there was this idea for a while that I think that ready-to-wear was the place where the real exciting design happened. You had, you know, your Phoebe Philos, you know, you had that kind of real push of energy, Rei Kawakubo, you know, all the excitement was in ready to wear, and it felt like couture was some kind of this fuddy-duddy old thing to speak very simplistically. And I question whether that'll kind of flip now, and as people look at the pace of fashion and they stop thinking about ready to wear as something that's the creative force, and that goes back to being couture. I wonder, do you notice that with your younger readers? Do you think they're interested again in couture because it feels like it's where creativity
also, I
can
think,
happen?
you know, couture is the one thing that's not saturated in a market that's super saturated. And for younger readers or people who are constantly bombarded by fashion blogs or like life, you know, the stream of this and this and this and this, and like there's fashion constantly for them. And because couture is a natural slowdown, I think it's interesting for young people today because they see the differing pace, you know, and they see the way it's handled and they see the way it resonates with people. And I think that's why it's become more exciting, because in a world of mass, something that's kind of held out on a pedestal but starts to become exciting again.
Ready to wear is mass.
Yeah, and I think
today,
also
and
money.
couture is not.
You've
You
got
know,
to take
anybody can be a
money.
designer today, and it's working legitimately. You know, what are those guys? The Olsen twins. I mean, they're some of the most successful designers in the world. But you know, there's a difference between going to, you know, second-hand shops and picking up some clothes and having them regurgitated, which it doesn't make it not legitimate, but it's just that's not really design. That's regurgitating.
And do you think
But
that's
we're
what
talking
makes
about the younger audience, and I think it's important to remember how important money is when it comes to haute couture, because it really doesn't matter what age you are. You could be 16 or 65 or 106. If you can't afford 80 to 100,000 pounds, you know, for a beautiful ball gown, then you're not going to buy couture, no matter how much you might love it, or how relevant it might be. It's not really, I think, a question of age or even attitude. It's to do with the money in your pocket. And if you're young and you happen to love Givenchy, then how much more thrilling is it to go and be personally fitted by Riccardo and own a piece of Givenchy that is specifically only for you, if you could afford it.
But I guess there's this idea of removing the commerce aspect altogether from fashion, whether you're going to buy it or not. I'm just interested in that point where it stopped being the case that people looked to ready to wear because it was the most exciting designers, and then perhaps looking to couture again because they feel like actually that's where the true design is going to happen, where they're going to be shocked and surprised. And I think people don't feel like they're going to be shocked and surprised by the ready to wear anymore. We've even lost this idea of kind of narrative fashion or the theatre of the show. It's very kind of commercial. And
buying it doesn't really matter. You know, the actual commercial transaction is actually irrelevant about the couture. It's an inspiration. You know, fashion. It's about making people dream, and you know, you can dream about it and still get something from it and be inspired by it and wonder at it, because you're not always wondering at ready to wear, because you know, some people do ready to wear that is couture, but then there's a lot of ready to wear.
And I also think maybe the commerce does come into it slightly, in that couture is so far removed from 99% of the population's pockets. You don't think, oh, you know, desperately I'm looking, oh, maybe if I save up and I take out a credit card and I can do this, then I can get the, you know, the it bag of the season. It's just not going to happen with your couture dress. You know, it's always that fantasy. It's always like, I'm going to be the Queen of England. You know, it's always that. It's so you can completely dream and be immersed in it in a free way, rather than trying to make some strange mental calculation in your head. You know,
I think the money is actually irrelevant. I think it's about interesting people and exciting people. And people that are interested in fashion, they like it whether it costs £5 or £50,000. You either love it or you don't.
Tell me a bit about, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but tell me a bit about working with some of the couture houses and what it's like to be in that environment. It must be amazing.
It's like a religious experience, because you know, I worked at Chanel Couture for about 10 years, and it was incredible, because the actual people who produce the clothes, you know, they spent hundreds and hundreds of hours making the most incredible things. And it was completely different to the ready-to-wear, because at ready-to-wear there were kind of rails and rails of clothes shipped in from factories, whereas for the couture there were, you know, various technicians, bringing to life Karl Lagerfeld's every idea. And what was interesting was that every season they didn't, you know, they weren't, they didn't think in an old-fashioned way. They didn't think, oh, you know, they liked that it was different every season. And the couture is about excellence, be it fabrics, fabrications, technique, technical people. Every area was about the best it could possibly be.
And it's about love.
Yeah.
Because the people in the ateliers love what they're doing, and they love.
They take it much more
You know,
seriously
the
in
dress they're
Paris than they
working
do. I mean, they do here as well. There's just less of it, but in Paris, it is. It's a different level of respect for people who work in. You know, if you look in any of the ateliers in London, it's not necessarily English or Irish people that are working there. It's cultures that have always worked in, had that expertise.
It's given more social gravitas generally, I think, in France. I think, you know, like the average person in France, as you were saying, you know, they might not necessarily, people who come in to see your exhibitions know the difference. I think in France, a lot of people would know the difference. You know,
There's
it's
more respect for your
celebrated as
hand.
like part of the national heritage.
Yeah.
Plus, for example, all those companies like Le Marier and Lesage and Maison Michel, they're actually all owned by Chanel today, because if Chanel hadn't bought them, they would have disappeared. And so I'm sure it goes for all the other areas as well, buttons or fabrics or ribbons. You know, it's incredible how, you know, it's quite difficult to find materials of quality today, because not everybody's looking for that quality, because there is a commercial element when not everybody can afford ribbon that's £100 a metre, but it is good that it still is there
It's
if
still
you
there.
do want it, because, you know, you can buy an amazing car, or you can buy a car that's £500. It doesn't make one better than the other. It's just, it's different levels of quality. Really.
I think it's incredibly astute what you were saying about as well, about this idea of the respect for your hands, because it seems like that's something that's really innate in French culture. You know, this idea of craft is there's something aspirational. People want to work in that kind of context, whereas in London,
Craft is not respected in the same way here. You know, if somebody goes home and say they want to be, you know, they want to work with their hands, not everyone's thrilled. Not every parent is thrilled about that. You know. You know, you kind of think that if you're not working with a computer today, there's something wrong with you. I mean, it's fun to work with a computer, but not everybody has to work with a computer. So, working with one's hands is a very exciting thing to do. It's therapeutic. That's why, you know, in hospitals when you're ill, they have people make things, because it's food for the soul to actually make something from nothing.
Completely. Let's talk a little bit about some of those sort of Gaultier codes that you kind of cited earlier, Oriole, because I think, you know, we've mentioned men in skirts, which I think is very important, but I think it's worth saying that as much as him being an incredible designer and craftsman, he is just an incredible showman, and he is incredibly modern in how he pushes fashion forward, and there's that cheeky sort of playful, subversive element to what he does. What is it about him that was so sort of shocking or surprising, and that sort of made people sit up? Was it him putting men in skirts? What was it that kind of...
Basically.
I mean, because he dared.
Yeah.
And he was anarchic. We would sort of print images, you know, of Jesus Christ on things, or he'd have skirts that were so short you could see knickers, or he'd do completely see-through, or he'd take a trench coat with absolutely no back, so you saw suspenders. I mean, he didn't mind sort of where he plucked his ideas from, his incredibly fertile imagination, but with a sort of naughty fun edge to it, wasn't it? He was having fun, and sort of saying, look, you know, this is not shocking.
Yeah.
I think new is probably more,
Yeah.
you know, it was always different.
Different,
new.
yeah.
You're attracted to what's new. You know, the normal becomes, or the abnormal becomes normal eventually, but it was abnormal initially when he did many of his tricks.
And I
But
guess
now he kind of, you know, they are his, he's made them his own. So, like at Chanel, you have, you know, camellias or tweed
cardigan
or
suit.
chains or things. He also has been one of the only designers to accumulate elements that mean Gaultier, when very few designers have been able to achieve that, which is why there's so many designers today. He has, ingredients, or he has his own ingredients, and very few people have actually achieved that.
Yeah.
Tattoos,
Yeah.
sailors,
Yeah, and I think
tartan, trench coats, polka dots. There's so many things.
Bustiers,
corsetry, suspenders. Fishnet tights, stockings with seams. There's so many sort of little elements that instinctively are Gaultier.
What are some of your favourites? Oriole, you're kind of nodding and smiling. I think
I just think also
cheering,
that the sexuality is so important, because, in the 80s he was pushing the idea of gender bending, and, he was a provocateur. He wasn't scared to sort of put things out there that were still a little bit, people really didn't know how to sort of react to them in a way. So I think that's very important too, because, he's really sort of championed that.
Also, it never looked aggressive, weirdly
Yeah.
enough.
No.
And some designers, they're really good at making aggressive-looking fashion, whereas his fashion, it was a little aggressive, but it never actually looked aggressive. So that's
It wasn't
quite
threatening.
No,
It wasn't
sex
threatening.
appeal is like a pin-up girl kind of sex
Yeah.
appeal. There's a bit of a twinkle in her eye, but it's not.
There's an empowering, I think pin-up's quite a good thing, because there's something quite empowering about it. It doesn't feel like she's objectified. There's that twinkle in her eye, as you say. But it's hard to be shocked now, though, isn't it? Do you think that's...
Well, who's shocking today?
Exactly. There's it feels like we've seen everything.
Alexander McQueen was the
Yeah.
last shocking designer. I mean, there isn't really a designer that's doing anything on the same level as he did that.
But do you think there's territory left for that? I wonder if it's...
Of course, because, there are always new people that come along, but nobody's happened yet.
We're waiting.
Well, let's see if we get shocked now. Should we see what we've got for this season? Why do you, just to kind of jump into this idea of sort of being shocked, do you think that's something you notice as well with working online, that's something to do with the web and that kind of proliferation of information and content? Has it made people a bit...
I think people get slightly numb to things, for sure. I even get slightly numb to things, or I'll post things on Purple's Facebook and then it gets removed and then I get banned. and I was like, oh, there was a nipple. I had nipple blindness.
Yeah.
That I think the idea of you become so equated to the way things are that you don't even realise that they might be shocking to some people.
Yeah, so I think that's really astute. Always going to be a little hard to see on the screen when it's Gaultier, but we can do our best. Should we just knit through and then...
See, look at the corsetry there.
Yeah.
On that red.
It's a fabulous silhouette. So.
And how fantastic the girls look.
Yeah. And they look so
Yeah.
empowered. I think that's the thing. They look so confident and like they're having fun, which is not something you see on runways very often.
Well, they look like women, like
actual women.
actual women.
Yeah. We mentioned, Hilary, you just mentioned, the corsets, which is obviously such a sort of Gaultier Mr. Pearl signature. What other of the sort of Gaultier codes that we've all kind of been hinting at are coming through from this?
Well, there's the fishnet you were
Yes,
talking
the
about.
fishnet,
that
yeah.
showgirl headdress.
But fishnet, not just for stockings, but for dresses, inserts, coats, and also variations on the trench coat, which he always loved.
Yeah.
Partly, I think, because of the whole idea of sort of
Flash.
flashing, with nothing underneath, or a rocket cone bra or whatever. But he would make that trench coat as perfectly, as anything else, an evening gown.
This is quite serious, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think for Gaultier, it feels quite grown up in a way. So far, there isn't sort of the
It's less costumey than some of the previous seasons have been incredibly
the
playful.
Catwoman. Yeah. So this is really interesting.
I think perhaps though, not to sort of move the discussion away too much, but it is an interesting week in terms of couture. I think more than ever people are looking at couture this week, so it's interesting. I feel like everyone's probably reconsidered how they want to position themselves when they know so many eyes will be on it, whether that's for Schiaparelli or for V&A with Hussein.
And I think also because there is a kind of younger audience who are on the red carpet or involved in in business in some way, who actually want this kind of these clothes.
Well, they're saying there's a new audience in terms of the buyers as well. You know, there's a lot of women from Russia, for example,
Young
who
Russia,
now have the
Chinese,
money.
Yeah.
And people really do buy his clothes.
Yeah.
You know, many couturiers, they don't really sell anything. But people, you know, I make hats for women that buy clothes, and they do buy Gaultier.
Who are the kind of women that love him? Is it incredibly varied?
It's varied, but they're quite highly sophisticated women. I mean, they're pretty wild. And you know, I went to visit this woman in one of his customers in Athens, and it was the middle of summer, boiling heat, and she was wearing, you know, some knitwear. Okay, she had you know, air conditioning, but you know, she just loved it. She just thought, you know, she just said, I hate tracksuits. So, you know, I prefer to wear this at home to have a drink with my husband.
Do you find
Which was pretty bizarre, but fantastic. Otherwise, you wouldn't have those kind of. Otherwise, this wouldn't exist.
Yeah, and being around those kind of women, I guess for you that it must be incredibly inspiring to work with someone who has that kind of a.
Well, it is, because, you know, as a designer, people always ask, you know, who really wears that. Well, people do really wear that, and you know, we do have customers that really wear that. There aren't thousands of them, but there aren't thousands of people that wear this, and that's not really the point. But they are interesting people, and it is interesting that they care enough to, you know, buy. You know, they don't buy one piece; they'll buy 10 from him of a season, or they will really enjoy it, and they are actually supporting a whole industry of people.
Yeah,
I mean, the clothes are outrageously expensive, but it's, you know, they can afford it.
Yeah.
And also, if you broke it down, you know, in terms of 800 or 900 hours of work,
You're getting
perhaps
a lot
just
for
on the
your money.
beading,
Yeah.
then you can kind of start to understand why, you know, the prices might be quite so astronomical. But they have to be, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to do it.
And they do fly teams of people.
Yeah.
You know, when you actually go and fit such customers, you know, there are 5 people from the house. There's the shoemaker. There's, you know, every accessory person with them. So there are teams of 10 people flying to visit them 3 or 4 times to, you know, the other side of the world. So it does all really.
It's worth it, isn't it? If you have
Well,
the money.
they seem to feel
Perfect.
so.
Yeah.
He loves gloves, doesn't he, Jean Paul?
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
talk a bit about the collect. What's your take on it, Oriole, from what you're seeing?
Well, it's interesting just having seen it. We were talking about the codes earlier. So the little matelot, the stripy top came in a sort of feathered fringe.
Yeah.
There was the sleeveless denim jacket, beautifully
Yes.
reworked there. So it's interesting that he is sort of inserting these, and then that
Because that's
sort of
very typically his, like, playing with the idea of denim as a couture material
Yeah.
as well.
and the bustier there, you know, the typical sort of 50s underwear look. So that's interesting. Along with this sort of new look silhouette that he seems, this very nipped in waist and this sort of very beautiful sort of hip shape that's going to go.
What does this say about how he sees women? Because we've touched on, you know, how he's a very sexual designer, he's a very playful designer, but what does this say about how he wants women to be or to feel?
I think he loves them.
Yeah, it's a very positive message, I think, always. I think,
He wants
you know,
them to dress up,
Yeah.
you know, to put some care and a lot of care and thought into their appearance.
But also I think they're women who should be the head turners when they walk in the room. You know, he wants his woman to make a statement when
You'd
she
be a little
appears.
bit afraid of her, but in a really good way, I think. Are you impressed by what you're saying, Hilary? Is this what we want from Gaultier? You know, you can't help but be cheered by it, can you?
No, it's making me feel happy.
And that's what couture should do, isn't it?
I'd love to be there and be able to feel. Oh, look at
That's
the fishnet.
incredible.
That's incredible.
Feel, you know, because I always think that's really how you can
You get to see the
sort of get
craft.
close
Yeah.
is by touching.
That look, number 29, that's just
That's Lee's
everything.
look for the season.
Yeah, that's my look for this. That's incredible. I just love how playful that is, this idea
Yeah.
that you could be, you know, a man's shirt who you've just spent the night with, and then you're slinging on this big shirt to nip across Paris to go back home. I just love it. There's such a story to it. It's amazing. Absolutely incredible.
And look at the butterfly. Wow.
Yeah,
Yes.
which you're seeing on the head as well.
Yeah.
Do you find it inspirational to look at something like this, Philip? Does it get your kind of, what could I make to...
Of course, but you know, I'm always excited to see how somebody can make, you know, everyone's used butterflies, but he's managed to do his version. I mean, Mugler used to do butterflies, Montana did butterflies, but he's got his own version of butterflies. They're kind of frilled butterflies.
And you haven't ever seen anything like that before?
Mm.
No.
It's quite
I think that's interesting that you say that as well, because we've talked a lot about the codes, and there are elements in this that feel familiar. You know, we mentioned that denim jacket, we mentioned the fishnets and the corsetry, but none of it feels like repetition. It feels like he can reference himself but still be do something shocking, which I think is coming through in this.
It's quite an elegant take for him. I think it's, you know, feels...
It's quite mature.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in a couple of the seasons that we've seen previously, it hasn't, as you say, been quite so sort of elegant. There's been more of a focus on it being kind of almost costumey and very fun, and it's been more about the show, whereas this
This
feels
is amazing.
Look
Yeah.
at that 36.
It's amazing.
The one butterfly wing.
But there's something quite dark about that. I think this idea of a broken butterfly, it's quite...
Sort of etymology. No one's got a pin through their middle yet.
That's not the closing look, is it? No. Because we've got Beth Ditto closed the show, didn't she? I'm quite excited to see this. Yeah, I know. Kind of.
Beth Ditto as a butterfly.
That's
I
pretty
hope.
amazing. What are your thoughts on the headpieces, Philip?
Well, they're fantastic. I mean, he's a great hat designer, and always has been. I mean, he's always had amazing, fantastic hats in his shows, always. So that must come from him, because it's always been consistent. They're never sort of, you never see dodgy hats in his show.
Do we see dodgy hats in this one?
Of course.
I'm interested in the relationship. You know, you mentioned the sort of working on the Chanel couture and how that creative relationship works in the context of couture. Sort of how you'll go about producing a hat for a collection.
It depends, you know, sometimes you know in advance, and sometimes it was a little bit like, do you remember that TV show, The Generation Game? Where, you know, you had to make something in 3 minutes. So one of my most frightening experiences with Karl Lagerfeld was, you know, I didn't know whether to call him Karl or Mr. Lagerfeld when I met him first. And
Or the Kaiser.
and so, you know, first time I worked with him, I sort of came in the room, and Linda Evangelista was there in her prime, and as he walked in, he said, "So what do you think?" So, and I just thought, "You mean now? Here, this second?" And he did. So you just have to think quickly. But sometimes you learn from doing things very quickly, and then sometimes you have weeks in advance, but sometimes you have no time.
Do you feel like that working on the couture shows, that there's always this idea, you know, that the couture is the laboratory of ideas. For you, was that where kind of the biggest kind of creative jumps came from, working on
Yes,
something like that?
because, you know, with somebody like Karl Lagerfeld, he is a very accomplished designer, so, you know, one season his idea would be clouds, and the next season it could be, I don't know, a number of other things. So it could be, you know, a modern artist or Frank Stella. So it was always challenging, and it was always something you thought, I don't know, until you actually came up with it. But pressure makes designers come up with things. That's probably the biggest, you know, incentive, really. The
And I
pressure of having to perform.
It's a different kind of pressure to the pace pressure that you get from ready to wear, which I think kills a lot of creativity.
Well, the pressure, I mean, it's different pressure. It depends who the designer is, but sometimes the pressure from the ready to wear is waiting for the clothes to come in from the factory.
Just before the show starts.
We're waiting on the last lick, but should we have a look at some close-ups while we go? Because it'd be nice to see some of those.
The other thing I always love is, you see where the show is, that's his headquarters in the Rue Saint-Martin, and it actually used to be, I think, the old French Communist Party headquarters before.
Wow.
Gaultier acquired it, but it's brilliant. It's like the whole building
It's amazing.
with wonderful marble staircases with wrought iron balustrades and banisters, and it's sensational. And around this, there's a kind of sort of balcony all around it, kind of almost right up in the ceiling, and a lot of the staff who work will stand there and watch, looking down. But it's so squeezed to get people in there.
What do we think
So
of this
tight.
kind of theatrical element, like the girl in Look Number 5? You know, she's smoking. What do we think of this kind of? Because that's so that we've really lost that. You know, you mentioned McQueen Philip before, and
But she's very French.
Mm.
I mean, she's. I mean, it's a very French attitude.
Yeah.
But you know, it's an unusual, interesting colour that maybe not every designer would be inspired by, but obviously he is.
Yeah.
So, and it's all beautifully done, and a fantastic mask.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And we need a bit of that kind of that attitude and insolence.
Yeah, and I think the opera gloves actually, you know,
Yeah.
you could wear anything with opera gloves and you've got a bit of theatrics going on.
And I think the other thing too is that
the fetish
he's not
element
using
to
that
it,
cigarette
isn't
Yeah.
to be provocative.
No.
I mean, it's just completely and utterly natural,
Everything feels very authentic, doesn't it? Which is.
authentic, because it is so French, a woman doing that, smoking. I mean, if you go right back to early Saint Laurent photographs, it's a very French thing, not like, say, you know, a model perhaps for Marc Jacobs lighting up.
Which
Well,
is
she
very-
looks like a very confident woman. I don't think there's anything fragile about
No.
this lady. She's tough and French and sharp and
Sharp.
chic.
But it's interesting, I think, because it's no mean feat to do something that is so kind of almost caricature-ish and almost could be cartoony, but it doesn't feel remotely gimmicky, and she never looks uncomfortable.
No, it doesn't look kind of old-fashioned French. It looks
Natural.
contemporary.
Yeah.
Would you want to wear this, Paula? Would you like to be that woman?
I think so. I'm not sure if I would like get stuck somewhere or something. I think my British balance is not quite there yet, but up to the job. But I could try.
I love that British balance, not up to the French sensibility of the collection. But we're impressed by what we've seen then. Yeah.
It's good, really good.
We got a last look yet? Huh? Okay, cool.
Desperately hoping for that.
I know, I really can't wait to see Beth Ditto. But can we talk just a little bit more about this idea of the fashion as theatre and as something that is kind of playful and fun and energetic? Because that's one thing that...
Dita.
Is it not Beth Ditto? I thought it was Beth Ditto. Is it Dita Von Teese?
It's Dita.
Wow,
Yeah.
look at Dita's waist.
Oh, I was really
though.
excited for Beth Ditto. No. But that waist is amazing.
Wow.
So obviously Dita's been Mr. Pearled.
Yes.
Definitely.
And the feathers.
That's amazing. Let's talk about Mr. Pearl, because I'm a bit... Have you ever met Mr. Pearl?
I've worked with Mr. Pearl.
Tell me about him.
Mr. Pearl is unbelievable. Mr. Pearl is, you know, one of the most interesting, unusual people I've ever met, and one of the most charming. I mean, his it's not a trick for him, but you know, he's you know, you mention a man in a corset and it sounds like drag, but it's actually not like that at all.
Yeah.
He looks like a very serious, conservative Victorian gentleman that happens to have a, what, 14-inch waist?
Wow.
15, yeah.
And it's difficult for him to laugh, so when he laughs he has to rock. So but he's a great sense of humour, and he makes the most unbelievable things, and he cares deeply about corsets, and he approaches it like a religion, really. You know, he's a very serious corset wearer, and that sounds ridiculous, but there is a name for people who believe in corsets and live by corsets, and he wears a corset 24 hours a day and has to sleep in certain positions to accommodate that.
Did he ever try and get you in one?
No, that's not my thing. I mean, it's impossible to get in his corset.
That's also, I think, a French sensibility. Is there's like a, I don't know, you know, a sexual undertone that's taken very, very seriously in
Yes.
France.
Yeah.
You know, sex is taken very seriously in France, and even, you know, with Holland and everything, you know, they're not upset about the affair. They're upset about someone delving into someone's affair.
Yes.
You know, it's a very, you know, the whole idea of courtesy and bondage and
Yes.
sex is something you should take quite seriously, and you're a woman empowered to.
I mean,
to
corset
own
wearing is
that
supposed
as
to be a sort
well.
of private pleasure,
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
But he does the best.
Best course.
I mean, I'm sure he's done that one.
Yeah, completely. Can we go back to Dita? Well, what do we think of your music? Because obviously Dita, she's burlesque star. What do we think about having someone that's kind of so, it being about burlesque and about performance?
Well,
It's very Gaultier, isn't it? He always has performers in his shows, and you know, again, it's that popular culture angle.
She's a butterfly of the world.
Yeah.
She's a very, very sweet person that is the most famous stripper in the world, but actually the weirdest thing about her is she's like a nun. So it's a bit like, because as a person she's very, very sweet, almost very, very conservative vibe to her, and she's the
Very
closest
soft
thing,
voice.
very sweet, and the closest thing I've come to meeting a nun, and she's the most famous stripper in the world.
But that kind of contradiction, that's very Gaultier, isn't it? That
Yes.
sort of playfulness.
She's very classy and very, you know, she's her own best invention.
But it's interesting to see something like sex used in this way, because I think, you know, it's interesting what you were just saying there, Paula. I think sex is so, it's missing on runways now. It's almost a taboo, you know, clothes aren't, this idea of something being sexy, it's seen as kind of antiquated, even though I think it's because there's preconception that if something's sexy, it means it's catering to a man, and everything's become very sort of stale and prim, and I guess maybe that's off the back of minimalism. But do we need a little bit more kind of...
I think the problem is for designers, they're a little bit scared with the whole internet and how sex has become almost pornographic, because everyone's trying to push things on the internet to be more and more shocking. And, you know, even for us as a publication, it's hard because it's Purple's, obviously, sex is a big part of what drives the magazine. And I think it's important for fashion to take that back. I think it's important for women to take that back, that in so much as I dress like a boy half the time, there's nights where you really want to go out and you want to, you know, feel like a woman and feel beautiful, and I think it's important for fashion to inspire that back.
I don't think you can generalise like that, though, because spring summer, you could take a designer like Lanvin, you know, Albert Elbaz. I mean, it's totally sexy and glamorous and gorgeous, and there's hardly a collection for spring summer that does not have either a peekaboo blouse or a see-through skirt, whether it be in lace or chiffon or whatever, or panels of see-through. So I think, you know, the sex is being expressed, but in a different way.
Different ways.
And I mean, there's always Roberto Cavalli.
It's quite a good mantra for fashion. There's always Roberto Cavalli. Is that the clothing lit? Yeah.
I think you've been misinformed.
Yeah, I'm sad. I want it to be Beth. Oh, well, in my head it's Beth. I can imagine her.
Yeah, Beth would look great in a
Yeah, she'd look absolutely incredible. It's amazing.
Spilling out over the top.
So has this done what couture should do? It's moved us, it's inspired us, it's made us want to touch and feel all those clothes and become a butterfly. Is that what couture should be about?
I think so.
Yeah,
It's about very complex clothing made to look beautiful, but it's very intricate work.
Should we give him a round of applause to round things up then, just because I love it. It's made me happy.